We hope you enjoy this episode of the Modern Divorce Podcast. But first, an important message for our listeners.
Hi there, listeners. I'm Billie Tarascio, the owner of Modern Law, and I'm here to talk to you about something that I believe can truly make a difference in people's lives. At Modern Law, we're all about helping individuals navigate the complexities of family law, and sometimes that involves dealing with alcohol-related issues. That's why I'm excited to tell you about SoberLink, our trusted partner and sponsor of the Modern Divorce Podcast. From real-time alcohol testing to its sleek and portable design, the tech of this device is top-notch. Facial recognition, tamper-proof results that are accurate and honest. This device can be court-ordered, or by listening today, you can receive $50 off your device by going to soberlink.com/modern. I stand by SoberLink because it works. I've seen it make a positive impact on countless lives. It's not just a device, it's a lifeline for those on their journey to recovery. We believe in empowering individuals to make positive changes in their lives. SoberLink is an invaluable partner on that journey, and I'm proud to endorse it. Again, visit www.soberlink.com/modern for $50 off your device and to learn more. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Divorce Podcast. I am your host, Billie Tarascio, and today I am joined by a long-time friend of mine from Eugene, Oregon, Lieutenant Officer Doug Mozan, and we are going to be talking about what the police do in various situations that you come across every day in family law. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Billie. Nice to see you.
So good to see you. So good to see you. So Doug and I did music ministry together for years when I lived in Eugene before I moved to Arizona. So we know each other really well, but it's been ages, and we won't make you listen to us catch up. We are going to dive into the substance, but if you see some chemistry, that's why. Yeah. So Doug, I've got so many questions that people want to know what happens when, and let's start with a few just questions. When a parent is pulled over and there's an open warrant or there's a suspected driving under the influence, what happens to the children? What do you do?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not going to get into the nuance of DUI law, but I will say that when it looks like we're going to take a parent into custody and there are children in the car, the first thing we do is try to find a relative to place them with, because the last thing we want to do is involve the government in placing children. If we can get a less traumatic and easier handoff. So usually that involves calling a spouse. In a case of a divorce, we'll call an ex-spouse. We'll call grandparents frequently. Very rarely do we have to get into the friends, but sometimes we have to go into a trusted family friend. The parent usually drives that bus in terms of placement. In very rare cases, when there is no suitable parent, and maybe the other parent has no custody rights in terms of the children, or they're indisposed, we may involve a foster placement if they're too young. If they're over, depending on what we expect the outcome to be, there's also a rare case where we may take them home, but they'd have to be like teenagers and able to care for themselves, and we would have to expect the parent to be available pretty shortly. So in a DUI, frequently we can take them, process them, and cite and release them, and have them transported back home.
Okay, so you're getting the contact information from the parent that you're arresting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, they're their kids usually.
Right. Okay. Well, that's great. That's good to know. So most of the time, if your spouse gets pulled over, your ex-spouse gets pulled over, and there's a warrant, your children are not going to end up in foster care.
Correct. Yeah,
good.
That's correct.
Good to know. That's good to know. All right.
And understand that cops are parents and children and brothers and sisters. So we're not out to inflict any more trauma on kids than they've already experienced through all of this. And so we try to make it as easy as we can to to treat these kids as we would our own.
Love it. Love it. Okay, let's move on to the next scenario. A parent calls in and they're reporting suspected abuse. So they get their child back from an exchange, divorced parents or separated parents, and there are marks on their child, and their child told them that something happened. What do you
Mhm.
do?
So in different states, it's different. In Oregon, anyway, and I realize we're probably in Arizona, they have the same standard we do in terms of forensic interviewing. So we would take a report and we would probably arrange for a forensic interview and possibly a forensic medical examination of the child. And that happens in a very trauma-informed way where you have experts in child interviewing and in child medical examining, if they're doctors and nurses who do nothing but interview traumatized kids who are injured. And we get the best information we can, and that happens in a videotaped and recorded setting so that we have best evidence in any later trial proceeding. But mostly we try to do this in a way that doesn't harm the child or doesn't further harm the child.
Yeah. So do you do that all the time? Because sometimes a kid has scratches and
Mhm.
people will post it on our Facebook group and they'll say, my kid came home with this and they were wrestling with their brother. Like, what would we do? Like in that situation, would you pull that child in for a full-blown forensic interview?
Not necessarily. We might get an initial interview or initial investigation, go to the other parent's house, talk to them, look at evidence, find out what's what. I mean, it's only in a case where we have a severe abuse suspected that we would go into a forensic interview.
Okay. So most of the time, let's say there's not something that's severe abuse. Does that mean there's not going to be a police report or an arrest?
Well, let's break it down for a minute. So, suspected abuse and abuse and severe abuse, I guess. I mean, abuse is severe abuse. Let's just put that out there. So suspected abuse and then actual abuse are sometimes two different things. So, a kid comes home with scratches, and it turns out that they were on the playground and took a digger at school and went home, and there's a trail that we can follow where there's a school nurse involved and there's an EA maybe that was recess duty that called it in. I mean, we can investigate that pretty quick and dismiss it and say this was not abuse, right? The child suffered injuries of childhood doing childhood things, childlike things, and or there's a brother or that's involved, and it's not necessarily an abusive situation. It's a sibling that's 1 or 2 years older, maybe a step, and they're wrestling, and it doesn't involve the parent, and there isn't a criminal case. Um, but in a case where we think there's actually abuse, then we're take that very seriously. We're mandated by a number of laws, and we are ethically bound by our oath we take to protect that child.
Next question. In Arizona and Oregon, corporal punishment is legal.
Uh-huh.
Parents are allowed to spank their children. Are step parents legally allowed to spank children?
So I believe they are, if they are married and have a custodial relationship with the child. However, understand that spanking and corporal punishment has limits, and there are lines, and when those lines get crossed and we have children that have injuries, then we can end up with a number of different statutes that apply to that situation criminally. And it could be criminal mistreatment on the easy end, and some sort of a felony assault.
Okay, so do you differentiate between married partners and unmarried partners in terms of what is allowed for discipline?
Well, we do, and it's only in the sense that if people are living together and they're living as married people, whether or not they're actually legally married, that's essentially a family unit. We would treat that situation as though they're married in terms of the laws pertaining to the spouses or to the partners. And then with the children, it could, I hate to say it depends and give you a lawyer answer, but it depends on how how long the relationship is, how parental that person is in the life of the children. If this is a boyfriend or a girlfriend of 2 or 3 weeks and they just showed up and they take exception to something the kid's doing and they spank them, I think I would take a lot more critical look at that than I would a situation where we've been living together for 2 years, we're not married, but the child spends 2 weeks or 2 weeks a month with this other partner, and they're essentially functioning as a step. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. That's really helpful. Because we have a lot of debates about, whether or not step parents should be treated legally like daycare providers
Right.
or more like parents. Like, where are they
Hmm.
on that spectrum? And it sounds
Yeah.
like what you're saying is they're more like parents, less like
Right.
daycare providers.
Right. And it again, it depends also on how a judge is going to interpret that in uh, termination of parental rights hearing or in a some sort of a custody hearing. Those interpretations are still wide open as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. There is a parenting plan in place or custody order in place, and one parent isn't following it, or the children are refusing to go with the other parent. You get a call that says it's my parenting time, and Johnny's dad isn't letting me pick up Johnny. What do you do?
Well, so we get these calls all the time. This is really a daily occurrence, if not at least every couple of days. And mostly we can mediate that. I mean, we are pretty good problem solvers, and there are custodial interference laws in both states that are pretty black and white as to how the parenting plan can be enforced by a custodial interference charge against the offending parent if they're not following it, and there are no mitigating circumstances or something bizarre happening. It gets a little murky when you have a teenager that's refusing to go, because now now we're in a bit of a sticky wicket. And technically, the parenting plan is very clear and says that the kid will go with their parent. However, we are in a position where we're a little bit like doctors and that we don't want to do any harm. We don't want to make it any worse. So, your average trauma-informed police officer is going to try to problem solve that and figure out a way to find middle ground. And that often involves both parents. I mean, it's not a very common thing where the kid says, "I won't go," and um, and the other parent is not sort of sympathetic to the or the other parent isn't aware of the sticky wicket they're in legally. Um, so, it could be a runaway situation. We're almost in runaway land with the other parent, but the custodial parent has an obligation to follow the custody order. I mean, I would expect the custodial parent to call the police and say, "I'm trying to take my kid back to their dad, and they're not cooperating. What do I do?" Because
Does
they're not going to
okay.
want to get in the grease.
Has that ever happened?
You know, I I don't know. I don't know, but it
Because
could.
I
But
can
it
tell
could.
you, I have never heard of a custodial parent saying, I can't get my kid to go. Usually,
Yeah.
what they're asking is, am I going to get in trouble? My kid won't go.
Well, exactly right. Okay, so that's a more accurate thing, but a custodial parent is looking to avoid consequence. I mean, any
Sure.
parent is, right?
Yeah. So,
And obstinate teenagers are a thing. Trust me,
oh, they
I've
are.
I've experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. So, how often do you actually arrest someone for custodial interference?
Rarely do we have to go there, and even more rarely do we have to go into a situation where there's a willful, like a parental kidnap situation. But once in a while, it happens. I mean, I've personally arrested a few people for custodial interference where they didn't, or cited them where they weren't following the custody order, and they were essentially inflicting more harm on the children and the games they were trying to play to avoid following the law.
Okay, and so how do you where's the line? When does somebody get arrested?
Well, when somebody is willfully withholding their children from the other parent and they are uncooperative when law enforcement contacts them, that's usually going to be where we dig in our heels and we start working on enforcement. I mean, okay, so a person willfully withholds their child from the other parent, law enforcement gets involved and says, "Hey, hand the kid over." We may or may not initiate a custodial interference case at that point if we gain compliance, that is. If we gain compliance, though, more often than not, the other parent is satisfied. That is the aggrieved parent that's calling us. They're satisfied because they've gotten their kids back. But we usually tell them, "Hey, you need to probably group back with your attorney and solve this so this doesn't continue to happen." Um, and then the custodial parent, we give them a stern warning. If you continue to do this, you're going to go to jail.
Got it. Okay, that's the next question. A parent is withholding. They say that they have a good reason. They say that there's a pending filing in family court. What do you do?
Yeah, very typical situation. We say, show us the filing. We want to see the legal paperwork, and more often than not, a person who is in a custody dispute where they are, really on top of the legal process has all their court paperwork, and courts generate paperwork for all these filings. So it's not like, just take my word for it. We're not going to just take your word for it. We're going to go based on the filing we have, and understand that we can get the court paperwork through our own process. And that's what we do before we respond. So we'll usually get a copy of the order before we go to the house, and we're holding black and white what's available to us.
Okay, so let's just take a scenario. Dad thinks mom's using drugs. Dad filed an emergency order. It was denied. So there's a hearing set on dad's temporary order, pleading, saying that mom's on drugs. Dad's saying, I'm not going to send the kids. What do you do?
So if the hearing was denied, then the order stands as far as the custody, and we're going to send the kid over to mom's. I mean, that's the ugly truth, that at the end of the day, if a judge rules that there isn't any weight to what dad's asserting, then we're going to follow the court ruling.
Okay. All right. And usually when that happens, it's, you haven't shown me there's an emergency, but we're still going to let this case play out. And so it feels like they're a little bit in no man's land. But
Yeah.
what you're saying is if there's an emergency that's denied, parenting time needs to happen.
Right. That's correct. And then understand that, in that circumstance, I would expect my officers, and certainly I would do the same thing in this circumstance, to probably take a pretty hard look at the parent I'm handing the kid off to, and see if there's any hazard there to the child.
What I'm hearing is you have a lot of judgment, and you need to exercise that judgment, and you're looking at the totality of the circumstances when you show up.
Absolutely.
So parents need to understand that this is not black and white, and they should cooperate, and they should make sure that they're sober and clean and kind.
Yeah, certainly. And understand that police officers are not allowed to take sides. We're not going to get emotionally involved in a case, in the majority of circumstances. And when you call us, we're not exactly your advocate. We're the law's advocate. We're there to make sure that the law is followed, and that the right thing happens at the end of the day. And that may not feel like the right thing when you call us, but know that we have everybody's best interest in mind.
Okay, next question. Somebody has brought a kid from a different state, let's say from Arizona to Oregon. The court order is in Arizona. Everybody's supposed to be in Arizona. Dad in Arizona finds out that mom is in Oregon with kids. She's not supposed to be there. He calls the police. What do you do?
So we're gonna go based on the black and white custodial order in whatever state it was issued. So we respect foreign restraining orders. We respect foreign child custody arrangement papers. If they're filed in a legitimate court and we can see that the pleading is there, then we'll enforce that, or we'll follow that. Just to understand that it's incumbent upon the filing parent or the calling parent to have that paperwork available to fax to us, because more often than not, this happens on Labor Day weekend at 6:30 p.m. when there's no chance that any court in Arizona is going to have any staff in it that we can get a hold of. So we want to see a signed, stamped pleading that we can be faxed or emailed.
Okay, so dad faxes over this thing. You go to the house that this kid's supposed to be at. Nobody answers the door. Nobody
Right.
talks to you. What do you do?
We're going to look for signs of life. We're going to see if there's any indication that there's someone in there. We're going to take our level best to the line of the law and see what we can do to contact that person. We're going to try by phone. We're going to try by, usually officers nowadays will try by text. They might try by social media. Depends on how tech savvy your officer is, but nowadays I get a tactical millennial up and we'll find all kinds of ways to contact people. And if we can get a hold of them, then we work the case. It looks like the house is vacant, or there's no way that they're going to answer the phone, and we aren't getting away to the door, we don't have cause to boot the door in at that time. We don't have any reason to violate the person's civil liberties on whose doorstep we're standing.
Right. Yeah. So if you don't have an arrest warrant, and we sometimes can go get a warrant for the police to take possession of a child. And sometimes that's what we as family law attorneys need to do. If that happens, does it change your behavior at all?
Well, it depends. It depends. Here's another vague one. An arrest warrant empowers us to take into custody a person who is violating an order. And if it's an arrest warrant that's extraditable from Arizona and we're in Oregon, but let's just pretend I'm working for Tucson PD and we're in the same state. We still aren't necessarily going to break the door down for an arrest warrant. We would, depending on what our local legal climate looks like, what our policy and procedures dictate, we may want to seek an additional warrant for entry into the house so that we can get the person. So we call that a body warrant.
Sure. Yeah, because a warrant to take possession of a child doesn't necessarily give you the right to enter someone's home, right?
Exactly.
To
Right.
find
Right.
that child.
Yeah, that Constitution that we swear to uphold is pretty sacrosanct to us, and we take it seriously, and we're pretty good at writing warrants. So, that's not a terribly difficult legal process, but there are some hoops we have to go through, and if we can't get through them, we're usually pretty straightforward with the parent.
Okay, finally, I want to talk about this intersection between what we call CPS. I think you call it DCFS, right?
They change their names all the time. It was CPS for me in California.
Yeah.
And here it's SCF, Services to Children and Families, but they also have a Child Protective Services division. So, they have a lot of acronyms, but what we know is it's the agency that ensures child welfare.
Right. So child welfare, that's what we're going to call it, child welfare. All right. So child welfare has some involvement. There's an open investigation.
The child is a ward of the state, perhaps.
Or maybe not yet. Maybe there's an open investigation, but child services has not taken custody, because I think that changes the situation, right? So if child services has custody of the children, let's take that first. What is your role when the state has custody?
Well, when the state has custody, and for that matter, in the circumstance I think you're describing, there's usually an assigned caseworker. And so that caseworker is usually a pretty valuable person to law enforcement, because they can give us insight into what the situation is with the child, what their living situation looks like, what the parents look like, what the needs of the child are if they're on the ball. And they allow us a great insight into how to proceed.
Okay. All right. And let's go back to Child Protective Services does not have custody, but there's an open investigation into child abuse.
Right.
You also get a report of child abuse.
Right. We cross-report.
What do you do?
Well, we're gonna investigate the case just like they are. And in most states, when a person's, particularly a mandatory reporter, a teacher, a priest, a person who works with children, gets a report of some sort of abuse, or they suspect abuse, they make a report to either the child welfare authorities or the police, and sometimes both. And then what happens then is the police will cross-report over to child welfare, and child welfare will cross-report over to police. And so we all look at these things. You got to understand, though, that these reports are come in with such frequency that they often stack up a lot before they actually get looked at. So, and that's an embarrassing thing to admit, but the reality is that your average violent crimes detective has a caseload, and so if they're not, if they're not only assigned to look in these things, they have to get to them, and they come in the time they get looked at. When the report comes directly to police, though, we're on it. We're already working on it. We're sending something over to child welfare. And when there's, we look into the smoke and we see there's fire, then we may actually enlist child welfare's help straight away, because we want to get that kid out of a hazardous circumstance and get them into safe custody of another relative. And that usually involves arresting a suspect in a criminal case.
Does the psychological treatment of a child ever rise to the level where you would get involved?
So, not usually. Emotional abuse is clearly defined in my state statutes, but emotional abuse doesn't usually have a criminal component attached to it. So, I think it's, to put it simply, it's defined in our statutes, and it is mentioned because of civil hearings, such as child custody hearings, termination of parental rights cases, and hearings where that statute or those where that definition may actually have weight. In criminal proceedings, though, we're usually limited to the realm of physical abuse. Emotional abuse is a thing. It's certainly something that unfortunately many children experience, but oftentimes there isn't a clear criminal nexus to the horrible things that are said and are said by parents and experienced by children.
Okay. All right. And what about the neglect line?
So neglect is again, there's emotional neglect, which is just like emotional abuse, absence of love, the cold shoulder, if you will. And then there's physical neglect. So failure to provide food, shelter, clothing, basic needs, medical care, all those things. And when we get a allegation of child neglect, we take those things seriously. We investigate. That's where we're frequently doing a welfare check and looking for food in the fridge, cleanliness, sanitary conditions. But understand, though, that those lines are a little blurry when it comes to the authority to take somebody into protective custody. Usually lies with the child welfare division. So, depending on how overtaxed that state's resources are, or that jurisdiction's resources are, they may or may not have that standard slides, I guess, a little bit. It shouldn't, but it does.
Well, and the other thing is, if there's two parents living in two homes and one of the parents is a fit and proper parent, then the state isn't going to take custody.
Right.
Because there's a
right.
parent.
They're not. No, they're certainly not.
So you've got one parent who is not fit, one parent who is fit. The state doesn't take custody. Most of the time, police are not going to make arrests. That really relies on the family court to get involved and make a custody determination. That's
right. And in terms of neglect, there's all kinds of gray there. I mean, when we're talking about, shelter is shelter, right? In a very traditional definition. And shelter in your house, I've been in your house, funny enough, and it is beautiful. It's immaculate. Every surface you could eat off. It's just as clean as you can get. And in my house, it might be less clean. And you may have your mom and I'm dad, and you may have a different standard than I do. And all of a sudden, we're put in the middle of this, trying to look and be objective and say, well, the house is dirty, but it's dry. There's no leaks and it's warm. It's not, the windows aren't open and there's food in the fridge, even though the food is all junk food.
Mm.
Um, we're not in a situation where we're going to do a thing about that.
Hmm.
If there's no other indications of physical abuse.
Let me give you a couple of tougher examples that are real that I've come across recently.
Mhm.
One is a mom who said, my 16-year-old daughter hates going to her dad's because she has to babysit her 4-year-old sister overnight for days at a time, and there's no food.
Mhm. Yeah. So now we're in a situation where we're not necessarily investigating the 16-year-old daughter situation so much as that four-year-old that she's caring for, right? The 4-year-old is the the 16-year-old is in a position where she can probably fend for herself. But we've seen this situation where kids are left for days on end and they're eating the condiments and there's horrible
Yes.
things that they're having to do for survival. And and that's certainly a situation where we would tackle that with the child welfare authorities as well.
Okay. So if you did a welfare check and
Mhm.
CPS is not going to get involved because let's say mom's a fit parent, would you pick
Right.
up that 16-year-old and take her to her mom and take the 4-year-old into CPS custody, or what would you do?
Yeah, we would probably coordinate for mom to come pick the 16-year-old up. And if the 4-year-old is a step, then we would try to find if the 4-year-old had another relative. I mean, if
Sure.
there's probably a grandparent somewhere or an uncle or an aunt or someone that, and the 16-year-old is usually the linchpin to that. So but once in a while, we have a situation where it's really elusive and we just don't know. And so then we would, the cops aren't daycare providers, and we're not. We, as much as we love being parents, we have a job to do. So we're usually going to hand that mantle off to the child welfare folks, and then they'll love on that 4-year-old and figure out what they need to do.
One other scenario that I think is tricky that's come up. Um, in this case, mom said that dad had lived in a car for a few years,
Mhm.
and dad still had a great relationship with the kids, would come over on Saturdays and spend time with the kids. Sometimes mom would let the kids spend the night with dad in the car, and people jumped all over mom. What do you think about that situation?
Well, here's the thing. I told you that the standards are rather subjective, and it would depend on how CPS viewed that situation. Because I've seen people's cars used as residences thousands of times in my career, and I've seen ones that are rolling squalor, and I've seen parents or I've seen folks who live in vehicles that I would stay in. So it's hard to say what that would look like. That car is very often an RV, and the RV may on the outside look like the Breaking Bad RV, and on the inside it might be a little nicer, or at least tolerable. And
Yeah.
again, the question there is it suitable in the very basic sense for shelter? I mean, does it have a place to sleep? If there isn't a place to go to the bathroom, where are we parking? What's the situation there? Is there food in the fridge? Or are the child's basic needs being met? And as much as we may want to cry, we're rolling away from that situation. If those boxes are all checked, then we're probably not going to get into a situation where we pick the kid up. But that's not to say that the custodial parents shouldn't probably be visiting. If they have a problem with that, they should be visiting that in family court.
Right, right. Is there a policy, or how do you handle when you go into a house to do a welfare check and there are drugs present? Is that an
So
immediate removal of
that
kids, or is that gray?
it's become gray in Oregon. So let me just go back to the past, and I'll say that drug use around children are some of the elements of the crime of child neglect in my state. And I haven't researched that in Arizona law, but in the West Coast and in the Ninth Circuit, they often are fairly mirror image of one another. So I would expect that's the case. Oregon made the decision to decriminalize most drugs after the voters willed it. And so that makes it a little more complicated. But when there is access to drugs and drug paraphernalia by the children, we take that into the child neglect realm. I won't, I would have a hard time finding any of my officers who were tolerant of that situation.
I see. Makes
The
sense.
fact that the parents use drugs, though, is not necessarily something that's an automatic DQ.
DQ.
Not thinking about a sports term, right? It's not an automatic. Well, the parent is a drug user. We're not automatically gonna call a foul on them or a penalty, if you will. But if they're
Sure.
using in front of the children, they're leaving wrappers and paraphernalia and things where the kids have access to substances. Yeah, that's a no-brainer. That's neglect, and it's hazardous to the children.
Awesome. Doug, thank you so much for your time, for answering my litany of questions. And I know this episode is going to be very, very useful to people who all have these questions. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah.
I loved seeing you personally. We can't wait so long next time.
Yep. No, totally. I appreciate you, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Take care. Bye. One consistent theme you'll hear from me, Billie Tarascio, is that we do not believe in a one-size-fits-all solution. That's why at Modern Law, you can find anything you need for your family law case. For the highest stakes litigation cases, we've got experienced family law attorneys who can offer you representation. We also have embraced newly licensed legal paraprofessionals who can offer you legal representation for less. And if you just need your documents prepared, we can offer certified legal document preparers as well. If that's not for you and instead you are representing yourself, congratulations. You are like one of the 70% of people out there doing it on your own. And our newest offering, Win Without Law School, can help. For more information about Win Without Law School, go to winwithoutlawschool.com. To get representation options, go to mymodernlaw.com.